Have a different discussion altogether, matters sanitation, and there is a conference that will be happening from the 28th of this month to do with matter sanitations at the KICC. And to talk to us about all this is Alex Manyasi, seated on my immediate left. He's the National Coordinator for Kenya WSSCC, and also seated next to Alex is James Wicken, the Global Policy Head at the WSSCC Geneva. These two gentlemen are here to talk to us about matter sanitation. Alex, when you talk about matter sanitation, what are we talking about exactly? Let's begin with that conference that's supposed to be happening here in Nairobi.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the conference actually started yesterday with the Children and Youth Conference. And the official opening is today, and it runs through Thursday. So what the conference is about is actually looking at what are the sanitation challenges that we have. What does the situation look like in Kenya today? And therefore, where do we go from here? I guess that is what the conference is about, organized by the Ministry of Water, Sanitation and Irrigation. And it's just supposed to put into context the issues that we have been discussing globally and now nationally. Remember, we have moved from the NDGs to Sustainable Development Goals. And so what that means also is thinking about sanitation in a different way. So we're moving away from just providing sanitation to safely managed. What that means also is that we are not only thinking about providing facilities, but where does the waste go after people use the facility. And
you know, when you began the conversation, you started by saying involving children.
Yes.
So why specifically children? Because when you talk about children sanitation, it's about this is how you need to wash your hands.
Yes.
After use of the toilet or before you eat, you need to wash your hands.
Yeah, so why the children is because they are the best ambassadors when it comes to matters providing. You see, when you're talking to a child, it's easier to mold them into what they become in future. When you're talking to adults, it takes a while to inculcate certain behaviors into them. So when you're talking to children, the intention is to ensure that the children, as they grow up knowing exactly what matter sanitation will involve and what that will entail. And that's why even when you talk about the issue raising of washing hands and how to wash hands, it's easier for them to pick up that behavior. Because if you look at some of the barriers to sanitation problems that we have today, include things that have to do with our own traditions. And therefore, our children who are growing up today may not know those barriers, and therefore when we instill some of these values into them, it's future to have a better society in future. So it's a long-term investment that we're doing. And then thirdly, it's also important to realize that the children are the ones who fall under the category of the vulnerable groups. And so it's a good target to have, because if you look at the staggering numbers of the number of deaths of children even under 5, it's a bit unacceptable for us to be losing children at that rate. But you see, that also contributes to the same situation of why we have to discuss sanitation matters.
All right. So, Mr. Wickens, globally, sanitation, how do you draw it down to the Kenyan situation? And how bad are we globally when it comes to matter sanitation?
Globally, Alex referred to the Sustainable Development Goals. So here we're talking about goal number 6, which is all around water and sanitation, and specifically a goal 6.2, which is about adequate and equitable sanitation for everybody, which is very nicely tying in with the theme of the conference this week, which is sanitation for all. So at the WSSCC, we're particularly focusing on basic sanitation for everybody, and particularly for women and girls and vulnerable groups. Globally, we're currently off track to meet this Sustainable Development Goal. We have around just below 700 million people who are still practicing open defecation globally, and around 4 billion people who don't have access to the safely managed sanitation that Alex mentioned. I believe when you take those figures down to Kenya level, we have around 10% of the population practicing open defecation, so 5 to 6 million Kenyans. So behind those numbers, there is progress being made, but we're always running to keep up with population growth. And on the global level, and then again at Kenya, we need to accelerate quite rapidly to meet these goals. And that's what the aim of the conference this week is all about, to bring together private sector, government, civil society, to really look at what's working, innovation, the challenges that we face, and how we can speed up this progress that Kenya needs to prevent all of the crazy thing about these deaths that Alex was sharing is these are all preventable deaths from sanitation-related diseases.
All right.
Yeah.
And when I look at the can I say the program of the conference that began yesterday, I can see there's I think it was yesterday when there's a session that you're going to be talking about the menstrual hygiene management. Why focus on menstrual hygiene management when you're handling matters of sanitation? Because you've also talked about, dealing mostly with women and girls.
That's right. It's a very good question. We talk about sanitation and hygiene as very interrelated. And hygiene includes things like washing hands, like you mentioned, but we're also talking about personal hygiene. And when we talk about women and girls, then we need to talk about menstrual health and hygiene. I was able to join that session yesterday with some of the young school children. And it was a wonderful session where they were being taken through the changes that happen in their bodies during adolescence, a mixed group of boys and girls, and trying to take away some of the stigma and taboo that surrounds this subject. So in the case of young girls, so that they are prepared for the changes that are going to happen to their bodies, and they're able to have an open discussion about that topic. Because I think for many young girls, the first time they experience their first period, they may have never had a chance to discuss that with an adult or someone that can explain what these changes are. So by talking again with children, we're trying to normalize these issues early on and really take away this very dangerous stigma that surrounds some of these things in silence for many years.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. And Mr. Menyasi, let me bring you in. Speaking in terms of the Kenyan situation, when you talk about sanitation, it has been a major concern, not only for the government, but also Kenyans, especially for those living in slum settlements like Kibra. It's such a concern because so many of them do not have proper sanitation in terms of toilets and also in terms of access to clean water. And also, we've seen institutions, government parastatals like NEMA, having to close down some factories because the discharge is actually affecting residents who are living within the factory environment.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation where we find ourselves in, and it's not that the situation was better before, it's just that it was not highlighted. And I like the fact that KTN has also been highlighting some of these things. So what has been happening, and the good thing is that cholera showed up in high-end places, and therefore that kicked off the conversation, because cholera was imagined to be a poor person's thing. What we forgot is that society is integrated, and therefore the people who also live in the informal settlements work for the same affluent areas. We forgot that the people who work in high-end hotels, we do not know where they live, and therefore the connection between the people of Nairobi is so interlinked such that cholera anywhere could easily be cholera everywhere. And so why I say that is because if you look at the informal settlements today, and you're raising that question, if I can respond, 65% of the Nairobians today live in the informal settlements. Almost 68% of the people living in Kisumu City today live in the informal settlements. The same situation in Mombasa. In the 47 counties of this country, since 2010, we devolved funds to the counties, and therefore we have created an impetus for development within those county headquarters. What we have not done is to look at how these cities and these towns are going to come up. And therefore informal settlements are also coming up so rapidly. And so as we look at how our country is changing face after devolution, we also need to be alive to the fact that there are certain challenges that will come with that. So as benefits come, there are challenges that we also need to deal with. So we have to balance both rural and urban when we look at matter sanitation. Now, when you look at the rural areas, some of the challenges are probably extreme, in the sense that you have people who have no toilets, and therefore, for them to venture out there, especially the women and girls and persons with disability and the old. So when you don't have a toilet, so what do you use during the day? It means you have to wait for nightfall. And when it's night, what are the dangers that come with venturing out there to relieve yourself? So those are the specific questions that come with issues of sanitation.
Right.
Now, if you're going to lose 3,000 kids per year in Kenya because of sanitation-related ailments, if you're losing about 57 billion Kenya shillings per year because of these ailments that are related to sanitation, if you're going to lose, if if more than 88% of the population have no access to a sewer line, if 70% of the people in hospitals today are in hospitals on ailments that are preventable, so it means that as a country, we need to rethink our strategy in terms of how we look at our population.
All right. So, Mr. Weekend, so does it mean, you know, from what Mr. Manyasi is talking about, the county governments and the national governments working together, so does it mean that there's a loophole? So who has failed? Is it the government? Is it the people? Is it because of lack of awareness?
I tend to look at it more positively. I think that there has been a lot of work that's been happening in Kenya to put in place what we call an enabling environment for sanitation. So over the last few years, we now have the right policies and strategies in place. We have something called Kenyan Open Defecation Free Roadmap. These are all very important for accelerating progress. What's now happening with since 2010 is that the counties are now having to put in place these same structures at their level, and inevitably that is taking time. But we're seeing some counties where that's moving very well. One of the next things that needs to happen, and a key theme for the conference, is around financing. So at the minute, when we travel to rural communities or some of the informal settlements in cities that Alex is talking about, we find that households are making the major investment. We also need to add in some public financing and some financing probably from the private sector. And then I think we'll see acceleration speed up. The governments across Africa have committed to allocating around 0.5% of their GDP to this sanitation subject, but not many of them have really made it up to that level yet. So that's something that we'll be discussing this week at the conference.
And in fact, it's the next question I actually to ask you, because it is one thing for different governments across the African continent, or rather globally, to meet and make decisions and resolutions. But these people argue that is this something written on paper? Implementation becomes the problem, commitment.
Yeah. So that's partly why this conference is important, because if you look at the Gore Declaration on what James is talking about, the 0.5% being allocated to sanitation, what essentially that means is that, because currently Kenyans are putting in more than 60% on sanitation. So the contribution by Kenyans themselves is slightly more than 60%. So it means Kenyans have done a lot. So the complementary part of it is supposed to be coming from government. Sanitation is a county function, and therefore some of the legal, regulatory, and structural adjustments that we have to do, like James mentioned, we have the sanitation policy, 2016. We have the Water Act. So a lot has been done. However, if you look at the utilities across the country, most of them are called water and sewerage. So part of what we are proposing is that by the end of the conference, one of the things that we need to move away from is water and sewerage to water and sanitation. Because if 12% of the national population is on sewerage, then what happens to the 80% who are using on-site sanitation? So that shift has to happen so that the larger populations can also be considered. Secondly, the issue of financing, it starts from the legal and structural changes have to happen. So we have the policies in place, but by making sure that the water and sewerage companies become water and sanitation, and that has happened for Kilifi, it has happened for Nakuru, it has happened for Kisumu, and that, Kisumu, Nakuru, and Makueni. So what that does is that it shifts focus to including everyone in the discussion.
Right.
So what that also means is that when you're allocating finances, the utilities can also consider the populations that do not have access to sewerage.
All right, but just to ensure that also, you know, every stakeholder, be it, you know, officials from the Kenya, you know, water sewerage company, or, you know, stakeholders when it comes to companies like Lifebuoy that has been at the forefront talking about matter sanitation, actually implement what has been agreed on. Are we likely to see stakeholders in this conference and make serious resolution? Because what I'm also seeing over here at the program, it is that there will be also a session on human waste training. So are stakeholders also part of it? And what resolutions do we expect from the conference?
Yeah, so on the part of what happened on the human waste training, and it actually happened at the youth conference, was trying to inculcate some of the behaviors that I talked about. But secondly, and most importantly, is to look at waste not as waste, but as a resource. Because what happened yesterday was to showcase some of the products or byproducts that come out of waste. One of them is briquettes. Another one is organic fertilizer. And there's also another upcoming big thing called animal feeds from waste. And so even as we do that, the young people need to know that we can create jobs in that sector. And the more we encourage people to know that we can create value out of the sector, the more we have more people coming to invest into the sector. Because you're not going to bring in private sector into an environment where they're not sure there's money.
All right.
So that is one of the incentives. And secondly, like I said, if we can make the young people and we can encourage our young people and young children to grow up knowing that they can actually grow into a sector that has money, then that's beautiful. Because currently, as we have, even our education and the structural systems are such that we train engineers who are sewerage engineers. We have not trained any engineers who look at sanitation as a bigger perspective.
All right.
And there are also, for instance, Mary University and Synergy have come into an agreement where we can even focus on training specific people who can come out and look at the sanitation challenges that we have.
All right. And as we bring this conversation to an end, Mr. Weekends, what is the globally, international communities, countries in the West trying to do when it comes to Africa? Clean, when you talk about sanitation, in terms of financial help, in terms of creating awareness, matters education?
So at the global level, organizations like WSSCC have joined something that we call Sanitation and Water for All, which is a global partnership between constituencies such as national governments, development agencies, the private sector, and learning and research organizations, really to raise the level of political prioritization towards these issues, and then to hold each other accountable for the commitments that we mentioned. You mentioned commitments a few times. Commitments get made, but we have mechanisms now to track those and to follow up and hold each constituency to account. So we believe by strengthening those mechanisms, then we can make a real acceleration in progress towards sanitation for all.
All right, thank you so much, James Weekend, the Global Policy Head at the WSSC Geneva, and also Mr. Alex Menyasi, the National Coordinator for Kenya WSSCC, talking to us about matters sanitation. The conference started yesterday. It's ending on Friday, and Thursday. It's ending on Thursday, actually the 31st of October. And we'd like all Kenyans to make their way there, and also children and women, to talk about matters sanitation in the country, bringing